Hey guys, Just Nintendo here. Before we get into the video, I just wanted to remind you guys to like, comment, subscribe to the channel if you're interested in any of my Nintendo-based content. Be sure to join the Just Nintendo Society Discord server. The link will be in the description below, as well as the pinned comment in the comment section. I hope you guys enjoy the video. Have a good one. There are literally countless games that I could think of right now off the top of my head that make me think, wow, that game is super underrated, or wow, that game deserves a lot more credit than it gets, or wow, why do so many people not like this game? And most of the time, a lot of the criticisms are completely valid, and they are this time around too. And I wanted to follow up with my video talking about Donkey Kong Country 1. I'm not sure why I'm skipping Donkey Kong Country 2, but we are, so here we are. I want to talk about Donkey Kong Country 3, Dixie Kong's Double Trouble. And before you roll your eyes and think, oh great, another person trying to tell me this underrated game is actually a masterpiece, just hear me out, because, look, I get it. Donkey Kong Country 3 has always been the black sheep of the original trilogy. There's no getting around that. It's the one that people usually rank at the bottom when they're listing their favorites. And there are reasons for that, absolutely. And they are all valid, they are all understandable, whatever. But honestly, I think those reasons are not nearly as substantial as what this game does right. In fact, I'd argue that DKC3 not only deserves more appreciation, but in some ways, it does some things better than its predecessors. So, let's get into this. First off, I think a lot of the meh reputation DKC3 gets comes down to timing. It came out in late 1996, and by then, the N64 was already released. Everyone was losing their minds over Super Mario 64. That game alone literally redefined what a platformer can, could, and should be. So when DKC3 showed up with its 2D gameplay and those pre-rendered graphics that this trilogy is known for, they were groundbreaking in 1994, but they were starting to look a little bit dated 2 years later. It just didn't have the same wow factor. People had, as unfair as it may seem, began to move on. But here's the thing. If you take Donkey Kong Country 3 out of that context, if you play it today without comparing it to the flashiness of Mario 64 or the novelty of the original Donkey Kong Country, you start to see just how much this game has going for it. The first thing I wanted to dive into is the gameplay, because, in my opinion, this third Donkey Kong Country game might have some of the best level design in the whole trilogy. Rare really went all out with the creativity here. Every level feels very different and has its own unique gimmick or mechanic to keep things feeling good. Like, do you remember Riverside Race? The fast-paced stage where you're being timed as you race through a riverside environment, or Lightning Lookout, where you're dodging literal lightning strikes that can zap you in an instant. I remember getting so frustrated with that level. And they're a lot more than just variations on jump over pits and avoid enemies, even though obviously there is plenty of that in this game. These are inventive variations. They're challenging, and they keep you on your toes. And speaking of challenges, let's talk about the difficulty curve. DKC3, in my opinion, is the easiest out of the three, and it strikes this very nice balance where it's definitely difficult, but it's not unfair or obviously impossible. It's the Donkey Kong Country game that I go to when I just kind of want to vibe, you know, as I talked about my vibes video essay on this game, talking about the atmosphere. It's the kind of game where you'll die a lot, obviously, sure, but when you finally figure out how to beat that tricky section, it feels great. It feels so satisfying. It's like the game is constantly saying, I know you can do this, instead of just being frustrated for the sake of it. And that's something that I think a lot of modern platformers get completely wrong. Now, I know one of the biggest complaints people have I have the same critique about Donkey Kong Country 3 is its characters. Obviously, Kiddy Kong. He's the Jar Jar Binks of this franchise. People hate him for being this big, clunky, some would argue ugly baby who's not as cool or strong or agile as Diddy Kong or Dixie Kong or Donkey Kong. And yeah, obviously, I get it. He's not the most appealing character design-wise, but gameplay-wise, he really is fun to control. Kiddy actually brings a lot to the table. His weight and strength let him do things that Dixie can't, like breaking through weak floors and bouncing off water. I didn't even know he could bounce off the water until like my second or third playthrough of the game. Plus, his dynamic with Dixie creates this really interesting balance between power and agility, much like Donkey and Diddy were in the first game, but just to a much fuller extent here. Okay, now getting on to the overworld, because if there's one thing that this game absolutely nails, it's the overworld. Instead of just moving from level to level, point A to point B on a linear map, you get this almost semi-open world with a ton of secrets to uncover. You can explore lakes, rivers, mountains, and there are even side quests where you can trade items with NPCs like the Brothers Bear. It's almost like Rare was experimenting with some light RPG elements, which is very ambitious for a 2D platformer, especially of this time. And then there are the secret caves, which lead to banana birds. Collecting all of them unlocks a secret ending, and yeah, it's kind of a silly reward, but the process of finding them is just so satisfying. It makes the whole world feel alive, feel connected in a way that's rare, no pun intended, for games of this era. And we need to take a second to appreciate this soundtrack, because, wow, Evelyn Fisher's work on this game is disgustingly underrated. If you didn't know, the soundtrack for Donkey Kong Country 3 was not composed by David Wise. Evelyn Fisher, she helped with the first game and the second game, more so the first game, but she helmed the soundtrack this time around, and I really do love the soundtrack. It was just added to Nintendo Switch Online 2 days ago at this point, so I'm glad that I can listen to it in an official capacity. And I think part of the problem that people have is they always compare it to David Wise's original scores for the first two games, which, to me, just isn't entirely fair. Fisher's soundtrack has an entirely different vibe. It's a bit more atmospheric and experimental and just kind of weird. With tracks like Waterworld and Rockface Rumble, the tracks create this sense of mystery and wonder. It's not trying to be as big, iconic, bombastic, or catchy as the music in Donkey Kong Country 1 and 2, but it fits the tone of this game perfectly. It fits the tone of this particular journey flawlessly, which brings me to the overall aesthetic of Donkey Kong Country 3. If Donkey Kong Country 2 is all about pirates and gothic castles, Donkey Kong Country 3 is more outdoorsy. It's got this whole northern wilderness vibe, which is just so refreshing to me. I love the atmosphere in this game. You have levels set in forests, lakes, waterfalls, and snowy peaks, and it's like the developers took a road trip through Canada and decided to turn their vacation photos into a game. And yeah, maybe it's not as immediately cool or edgy as DKC2's pirate theme, but it's so distinct when talking about these games. Like I said earlier, this is the Donkey Kong Country game that I play when I just want to vibe. It's just so endearing, and there's this cozy, adventurous feeling to it that just really sets it apart from the other games. I think what it boils down to is that Donkey Kong Country 3 is a game that's comfortable being its own thing. It doesn't try to copy every single aspect from the first two games, and it doesn't go out of its way to be new or super innovative or flashy or trendy. It's just so solid. It's confident. And that's probably why it's taken so long for people to appreciate this game. Because it's not a game that screams, "Look at me!" It's a game that quietly does its own thing and does it really, really well. So, if you take anything from this video, if you've ever dismissed Donkey Kong Country 3 or just kind of ignored it because you didn't think it looked or felt or played as memorable as the first two, I would highly encourage you to give it another shot. Play it with fresh eyes and try to see it for what it is instead of what it isn't. Because this game has so much to offer, and especially in this day and age, I've been seeing a lot of positivity around the game. It wasn't like that even probably 4 or 5 years ago. It was a much different ecosystem online when it came to discussing Donkey Kong Country 3, but there are plenty of viewers of my channel that this is their favorite Donkey Kong Country game, and I think that should be celebrated because it does have so much to offer. And honestly, as you're playing through it for the very first time, it might surprise you. And who knows, you might even find yourself thinking, hey, maybe this is my favorite Donkey Kong Country game after all.